The sea was a graveyard. Steel twisted like paper. Smoke hissed from shattered hulls. And the screams of drowning men were swallowed by the freezing dark. This was the reality of the Battle of the Atlantic, an invisible war fought not with armies, but with convoys and submarines, sonar pings and coded messages. For every ship that made it, another was sent to the bottom by the silent killers of the deep, German U-boats. And by 1942, the Allies were losing, critically, food, fuel, ammunition. Everything Britain needed to survive was vanishing into the ocean. Hitler believed if he could choke the Atlantic lifeline, Britain would starve and the war would be over. But deep inside the British Admiralty, one group of unknown minds, radio men, decoy designers, and naval tacticians, refused to surrender. They hatched a plan so crazy, so invisible, even German commanders wouldn't believe it. This is the story of the invisible convoy, a ghost fleet that sailed without ships, drew fire without dying, and saved a nation from collapse. It was a battle not of guns, but of deception, silence, and shadows. And the men behind it weren't warriors. They were ordinary souls. Quiet geniuses who changed history without ever being seen. The year was 1942, and the Atlantic had become a killing ground. Stretching thousands of miles from Halifax to Liverpool, the cold waters beneath the surface hid death. Wolf packs of U-boats that moved silently, hunted at night, and struck without warning. Germany had perfected this form of warfare. Dozens of submarines coordinated by radio signals, attacking convoys with ruthless efficiency. Each merchant ship sunk was a nail in the coffin of Allied resistance. Britain, an island nation, relied on those convoys to survive. If they stopped, food would rot in warehouses, factories would shut down, and fuel would run dry. Churchill called the U-boat threat his greatest fear, greater even than the Luftwaffe, because you couldn't see a submarine, you couldn't outgun it, you had to outthink it. But thinking was proving impossible. Convoys were slow, predictable, and stretched across open water like bait. Destroyers tried to protect them, but there were too few ships and too much ocean. And with every week, the numbers worsened. 1 month alone, U-boats destroyed 722,000 tons of shipping, hundreds of vessels, thousands of lives. The Allies scrambled for answers, better sonar, faster escorts, deeper depth charges. But one idea emerged from the shadows, an idea so strange it almost sounded like a joke. If we can't protect our real convoys, what if we made fake ones? What if we trick on the U-boats into attacking something that wasn't there? It began not with a general or an admiral, but a soft-spoken mathematician working in Britain's secretive naval intelligence division. His name is forgotten by most today, but his mind saw patterns where others saw chaos. He realized U-boats weren't just hunting by luck. They were using radio direction finding to triangulate convoy paths. If the Allies could simulate those paths, they could control where the U-boats went. But how? Ships couldn't sail without crews, without cargo, and building fake ships was madness. Unless you didn't need ships at all. The plan became a whisper inside Whitehall. Project Onion, a name chosen to reflect its layers of deception. It wouldn't involve a single real vessel. Instead, it would simulate an entire convoy using only sound, radio signals, and radar signatures. Sound engineers recorded the noise of real ships, propeller thumps, engine groans, rudder churn, and blasted them across the sea using underwater speakers. Radio operators sent fake signals mimicking stressed captains and panicked radio men. Tiny boats with aluminum balloons were sent ahead to reflect radar like massive tankers. And beneath it all, silence. No cargo, no soldiers, just ghosts. There were doubts. Would the U-boats fall for it? Would Hitler's naval commanders risk torpedoes on shadows? The Atlantic was vast. Mistakes were costly. But desperation breeds innovation. And in late 1942, as the U-boat threat crested its deadliest peak, the order came down, launch the invisible convoy. They called it Convoy ZQ-91. It didn't exist, except on German sonar. On the morning of November 18, 1942, a ghost began its journey across the Atlantic. There were no hulls in the water, no flags raised, no sailors waving from decks. And yet, to every German hydrophone operator scanning the deep, something was coming. It rumbled like 100 steel bellies churning against the current. It clicked like propellers under stress. It spoke in bursts of Morse, urgent, distressed, confused. A convoy in trouble, vulnerable, real. Only it wasn't. Convoy ZQ-91 was an illusion, stitched together by British deception units who had spent months perfecting their tools. Underwater sound projectors blasting pre-recorded merchant engine loops, false wireless traffic between fake call signs staged from remote land-based transmitters, radar reflectors mounted on small, quiet boats dragging aluminum-covered balloons to create massive echoes. It was invisible to the naked eye, but not to the German Navy. That's what made it dangerous. Somewhere off the coast of Ireland, 10 of U-boats began to shift their positions. Orders came from Admiral Karl Donitz himself, move east, intercept ZQ-91. All across the Atlantic, sleek black submarines surfaced under moonless skies, recharged batteries, and resubmerged to stalk this vulnerable target. They hunted in packs, surrounding what they believed was a slow-moving Allied supply line. But when they struck, they found nothing. No steel, no screams, just open water. Again and again, they wasted torpedoes on sonar echoes. Some commanders hesitated, unsure if their instruments were malfunctioning. Others radioed back frustrated, unable to confirm kills. A few fired in desperation, burning precious weaponry on phantoms. Hours passed, days, no ships, no wreckage, just fog and fake transmissions. And while they chased shadows, the real convoy, HX-212, crept past hundreds of miles south, protected not by force, but by absence. It was one of the largest convoys ever assembled, nearly 50 ships bearing oil, grain, steel, and medical supplies. Enough to feed Britain for weeks. It should have been a prime target, and by all German projections, it should have been hit. But ZQ-91's bait worked. The decoy had stolen the attention of over 20 U-boats, dragging the wolf pack far from the real prize. For once, the ocean favored the Allies. It wasn't luck. It was invisible warfare. But inside the British Admiralty, there was no celebration yet. The men behind the plan were not generals, but radio engineers, physicists, and codebreakers who worked in drafty rooms under bare bulbs, eyes red from sleepless nights. Among them was Arthur Hartley, a forgotten genius in acoustic warfare, who led the sound deception division. Hartley knew the limits of their trick. The illusion could hold for hours, maybe days. But if the Germans sent reconnaissance aircraft, or if one U-boat surfaced close enough, the ruse would unravel. The illusion lived in a narrow window of fog, silence, and faith. Every hour, the real convoy moved unscathed, felt like a heartbeat stolen back from death. In London's Naval Intelligence War Room, men watched in tense silence as encrypted German messages were intercepted and decrypted. They showed confusion, panic. Donitz's wolf packs were splintering. Commanders arguing with Berlin over why no ships had appeared. They didn't know they were firing into nothing. The ruse had worked, not once, but twice. ZQ-91 had drawn fire and saved lives, invisible armor, stitched from sound and belief. Yet outside the war rooms and code-breaking bunkers, the sailors of HX-212 had no idea how close they came to destruction. To them, it was just another freezing crossing, with black water stretching in all directions, and death always one ripple away. They would never know they were being protected by ghosts. They only knew they made it to Liverpool. Cargo intact, lives spared. And when the Admiralty tallied the U-boat positions afterward, they found the proof they needed. Nearly every enemy submarine had abandoned its prior patrol and surged north, towards ZQ-91. Entire German maps had shifted, entire strategies bent to a fiction. The real convoy didn't just survive, it vanished from danger. What had begun as a desperate experiment had turned into a working weapon. But Hartley and his team didn't celebrate. They couldn't. They knew the next mission would be harder. The Germans were smart. Deception worked once, maybe twice, but never forever. They would adapt, they would look deeper, and the illusion would need to grow bolder, sharper, and even more real. Yet in that moment, on that cold November night, the balance in the Atlantic had tilted, not with torpedoes or tanks, but with silence, science, and a whisper in the dark. After the success of ZQ-91, a quiet ripple spread through the upper echelons of British Naval Command, not loud enough to reach the headlines or echo across Parliament chambers, but deep like a seismic pulse under the ocean floor, felt by those who understood what had just happened. For the first time since the war began, the Allies had deceived the enemy not through camouflage or code, but through pure illusion. A convoy that didn't exist had redirected an entire wolf pack. The implications were enormous. This wasn't just a trick. It was a new form of warfare, one that didn't need steel, just imagination and nerve. If it worked once, it could work again. And it had to. Because despite the small victory, the Battle of the Atlantic was still bleeding Britain dry. So the invisible fleet grew. Behind closed doors in London, a special division was expanded under naval intelligence, codenamed Submarine Tracking Room X, and given one mission: multiply the ghosts. The room was filled not with soldiers, but with mathematicians, sound engineers, physicists, and misfits, people who had never held rifles, but knew how to bend reality. They worked with chalkboards instead of compasses, radios instead of rifles. Their weapons were decibels, signal triangulations, and wave interference patterns. Their battleground was the airwaves, and every transmission was a potential explosion. Leading this next wave of deception were minds like Reginald Victor Jones, a physicist obsessed with electromagnetic warfare, and Hugh Skillen, a code officer fluent in German naval procedure. They weren't warriors by birth, but war had turned them into something else: architects of shadows. The strategy was now clear. If the Germans hunted by signal, the Allies would flood the Atlantic with lies. Soon, multiple phantom convoys were operating simultaneously, each one carefully crafted to appear just real enough to trigger a response. Never too detailed, never too suspicious. They used decoy ships disguised as merchants, small trawlers loaded with reflectors and sound blasters. In some cases, even false distress calls were broadcast, imitating the panicked Morse code of a sinking ship. German operators would intercept a mayday, hear a screech of interference, then a final word: torpedoed. It was chilling, it was fiction, but it worked. Convoys codenamed DF-81, XZ-107, and Banshee 3 were sent across known U-boat hunting grounds. Every time, the same dance played out. U-boats regrouped, changed position, and converged on targets that faded into nothing. In one case, an entire German submarine group followed a fake convoy for 700 miles, burning fuel, missing rendezvous, and leaving their actual hunting grounds completely exposed. But this campaign of smoke and silence was not without cost. Not all phantom convoys remained untouched. One decoy boat, HMS Centaur, disguised as a slow freighter, was targeted by a German torpedo in early 1943. It was a glancing hit, and the ship survived, but the message was clear. The Germans were getting smarter. They were beginning to suspect that some of these convoys were traps. Berlin issued quiet directives warning U-boat captains to verify targets with visual confirmation. Yet, paradoxically, that played even further into the Allies' hands, because every minute a U-boat spent verifying was a minute it wasn't firing. And in that delay, real convoys could slip through. This cat-and-mouse game escalated fast. The Germans responded with new technology: longer-range reconnaissance aircraft, improved Enigma codes, and advanced sonar buoys. But the Allies didn't flinch. They adapted. They layered their illusions deeper. Some fake convoys began to simulate entire naval battles, with orchestrated soundscapes of distant shell fire, simulated damage reports, and even coordinated survivor signals from lifeboats drifting in pre-designated zones. It became theater, deadly, precise, and conducted on the edge of plausibility. These were radio dramas with blood in their margins, staged on the open sea, designed to waste time, misdirect force, and keep real men alive. And it worked. The numbers spoke. By mid-1943, German U-boat losses surged while Allied shipping losses dropped. For the first time, the Atlantic was shifting in the Allies' favor, not because they had more ships, but because they were using fewer to do more. Every Phantom convoy was a curtain drawn across the ocean, a curtain the enemy had to peek behind. And behind each curtain, nothing. Or worse, trap convoys armed and waiting. Yet even as these ghost convoys multiplied, their makers remained unknown to the public. Men like Hartley, Jones, Skillen, they didn't receive medals or newspaper columns. They walked home from their offices at dusk, past newsboys shouting headlines they had secretly helped write with silence. They lived anonymous, uncelebrated lives while shaping the very fate of nations. And that anonymity was by design. By early 1904, the Battle of the Atlantic had changed. It was no longer just about survival, it was about turning the tide. And the ghosts that once saved convoys were now being sharpened into weapons. Not just decoys, not just illusions, but traps. Deadly traps. The British Admiralty and its American counterparts saw an opportunity. If German U-boats could still be lured by Phantom convoys, then those shadows could be used not merely to avoid confrontation, but to force one. The Allies, no longer on the defensive, began to bait the enemy into kill zones, areas where long-range bombers, destroyer escorts, and hunter-killer groups waited in silence. This was the second life of the invisible convoy. Not just as a shield, but as a sword. It began with Operation Teardrop, one of the most ambitious deception efforts ever launched in the North Atlantic. British and American intelligence suspected that Germany, desperate and cornered, had developed new long-range U-boats, advanced Type 21 and Type 22-23 submarines capable of reaching the U.S. coastline undetected. Some believed they could carry V weapons. Others feared chemical attacks. What mattered most was stopping them, and that meant drawing them out. Once again, the Ghost Fleet was summoned. Fake convoys were broadcast across multiple radio frequencies, carefully staged to resemble high-value targets headed toward vulnerable ports. Each broadcast was monitored by Allied listening posts for signs of German interception. When a signal was detected, Allied forces traced the source, marked it, and moved in. For days at a time, entire flotillas of destroyers would silently trail the Phantom convoys, sailing alongside nothing. No cargo, no ships, just water. But then, sonar pings, a flicker beneath the surface, a periscope slicing the waves. And when the U-boat crept into range, the trap snapped shut. Depth charges plunged, explosions thundered through the sea, and hulls cracked like eggshells under the pressure. It was as if the ghost convoys were haunted, offering themselves as bait only to deliver retribution. In one 2-week period, 6 German submarines were destroyed through coordinated ghost-baiting efforts. They never saw their enemy. They never even knew they were chasing a lie. But it wasn't only ships being fooled now. The deception war had expanded into the air. Allied aircraft flying out of Iceland and Newfoundland were equipped with sound relays to mimic the acoustic footprint of massive merchant fleets. These planes dropped sonar buoys that sent back false echoes. They broadcast distress signals and navigational chatter, drawing German listening posts into wild chases across empty quadrants. The ocean was being rewritten in real time, each wave concealing not just steel, but story, a narrative of misdirection that forced the enemy to question everything they saw and heard. And still, the Germans adapted. In late 1944, as Dönitz realized U-boat losses were accelerating beyond replacement, he ordered a return to stealth. Fewer transmissions, stricter radio discipline, decentralized control. He hoped this would restore the advantage. But by then, the damage was done. German commanders no longer trusted their own intelligence. They hesitated, delayed, and in war, hesitation is death. One U-boat captain, intercepted weeks later by Allied codebreakers, had written in his log, "They are everywhere and nowhere, Baum. We fire at ghosts that fear." The psychological weight of not knowing what was real was the invisible convoy's most potent weapon. Behind the scenes, the toll on the men running this campaign was mounting. These weren't soldiers on the front lines, but the pressure was just as brutal. Hours spent deciphering German frequencies, nights filled with static, headphones pressed to ears, waiting for a flicker of enemy recognition. They weren't firing guns, but their mistakes could cost hundreds of lives. One miscalculation, one misread signal, and a real convoy could be exposed. The stress carved lines into their faces. Many drank. Some collapsed. Others never spoke of their work again. But still, they pushed on. Because the war wasn't over, and the Ghost still had work to do. By late 1944, Allied Command had formalized the Ghost Fleet into a standing strategy. It had names now: divisions, funding, doctrine. What began as an improvised response had matured into a weaponized art form. It was written into naval battle plans, taught to intelligence officers, factored into risk analyses. Invisible warfare had become standard, and it worked. The last major German U-boat offensives in early 1945 were complete failures. Their wolf packs surfaced into empty seas, fired at shadows, died chasing myths. And as the war neared its end, the final twist came. The Allies had begun using the very chaos they'd created to disguise preparations for D-Day. German high command was flooded with false information. Entire phantom armadas created to mask the real invasion. They never wore medals. Most of them never saw combat. Their names weren't printed in victory headlines or etched on war memorials. But without them, the Atlantic would have drowned the war effort. These were the men behind the curtain, the invisible minds who created invisible fleets. They didn't fight with rifles or torpedoes. They fought with wires, signals, and silence. Mathematicians, physicists, linguists, amateur inventors, civil servants and code breakers. School teachers turned signal officers. Radio tinkerers turned strategic visionaries. They sat in rooms without windows, behind locked doors and code names, building illusions that outmaneuvered one of the deadliest threats the modern world had ever seen. And in the end, they changed not just the war, but the way war would be fought forever. One of them was Arthur Hartley, a name lost to most history books, yet a man who quite literally changed the sound of the Atlantic. He had been a quiet engineer before the war, working on petroleum pipelines. But during the darkest hours of the U-boat siege, he was called into the Admiralty to help solve a problem no weapon could fix: how to defend a convoy without any real ships. His solution? Sound. Hartley developed sonic deception buoys, waterproof audio devices that could play loops of merchant ship engine noise. He and his team recorded every detail: the thrum of propeller blades, the metallic clang of boilers, the subtle turbulence against hulls. They layered these sounds until they could simulate entire convoys, drifting through the fog like audible ghosts. His inventions became the beating heart of the invisible fleets. But Hartley never spoke publicly of what he did. When asked after the war about his contribution, he only smiled faintly and said, "We made noise where there was none." That's all. There was Reginald V. Jones, the Oxford physicist turned intelligence officer who led Britain's scientific war effort. Jones had a mind that could anticipate the enemy, what they would hear, what they would believe. He wasn't just building tools. He was designing expectations. Jones was instrumental in manipulating German radio direction finding, helping to engineer the misleading transmissions that guided U-boats away from real convoys and into the path of bombs. He once described their work as a war of perception, where the goal wasn't to kill, but to confuse, to rob the enemy of certainty. His quiet battle was fought in wavelengths and frequencies, using logic sharper than steel. Another forgotten hero was Lieutenant Commander Charles Wynne, who operated within the Royal Navy's Radio Deception Unit. Wynne and his team designed phantom traffic networks, entire fleets of fake ships speaking to one another in Morse code. Every dot, every dash calculated. He knew how German cryptographers worked. He knew how their minds would trace signals, identify patterns, predict formations. So he built shadows for them to follow. He laced his messages with stress, with urgency, with false clues. And more often than not, they were believed. He once crafted a transmission mimicking a broken merchantman begging for help, its position slightly off from a real convoy's path. U-boats pounced. The real convoy slipped past unharmed. But perhaps the greatest hero of the Ghost Fleet was the Faceless Collective, the many who will never be named, the stenographers who transcribed intercepted German messages into the night, The WRNs, Women's Royal Naval Service members, who operated radios, deciphered code, and plotted U-boat paths on massive chalkboards without fully knowing why. The engineers at outposts in Newfoundland, in Iceland, in Bermuda, who monitored faint signals at 3 a.m., listening through static for signs of movement. They were not decorated. They were not written about, but they were there holding the line in ways no soldier ever could. They worked in conditions most would never accept. Cramped rooms, no heat, no recognition, just urgency, just pressure. If they failed, if a fake convoy signal was too faint, or a German sub intercepted a real transmission by mistake, it could mean hundreds of deaths. Entire convoys lost, supplies vanished, Britain starved, and so they labored not for fame, but for precision, for duty, for the simple belief that what they did, unseen and unheard, mattered. And it did. When the war ended and the Atlantic was no longer a graveyard, most of these minds quietly returned to civilian life. Some went back to teaching, some went back to building bridges or radios or farm machinery. Many never spoke of what they had done, official secrets. Acts sealed their stories. History passed them by. But the results of their labor remained. An ocean once dominated by silent killers had been reclaimed by invisible hands. Not by might, not by firepower, but by imagination. They proved something profound, that in a war defined by brutality, there was still room for brilliance. War is often remembered in iron and fire, in tanks that crush cities, in bombers that blacken the skies, in soldiers charging through smoke and steel. But the truth of World War II, the deeper, often invisible truth, is that not all victories were won with bullets. Some were won with ideas, with silence, with deception, and with ordinary people daring to imagine the impossible. The story of the invisible convoy is not just a chapter of naval history. It is a mirror reflecting something far greater, the power of human imagination in the face of destruction. A story where courage didn't always wear a uniform or carry a rifle. It wore headphones, sat behind code books, and worked alone in the dark. These were people who didn't need recognition. They needed results, because behind every illusion they built, behind every fake signal they sent, were real lives, real convoys, real sailors, real cargo keeping a nation alive. What these minds achieved should not have been possible. In a war defined by overwhelming force, they fought with nothing more than perception. They created entire fleets out of sound and static. They bent the ocean into a chessboard of shadows. They outwitted the most advanced naval hunting force of the time, not by fighting it head-on, but by making it doubt its own senses. What kind of mind dares to think that a fake fleet could be as powerful as a real one? What kind of courage does it take to gamble everything on the belief that the enemy will see what isn't there? That is the heart of this story, a triumph not of might, but of mind. And there is something deeply human about it, because every person behind this operation, every engineer, every listener, every code breaker, carried with them the same fear that haunted the soldiers on the front lines. The fear of failure, the fear of being too late, the fear of silence breaking into disaster. They were not emotionless machines. They were people who knew the cost of every error. They knew that one misjudged frequency, one mistimed broadcast, could lead U-boats straight to the real convoys. That weight pressed on them constantly, and yet they chose to act. They chose to innovate, because to do nothing would have meant surrendering the Atlantic, and with it, the war. In many ways, the invisible convoys did more than protect ships. They protected hope. During the bleakest stretches of the Battle of the Atlantic, when U-boat attacks seemed endless and Allied losses mounted, it was this campaign of deception that gave breathing room to a battered strategy. It bought time. It confused the enemy. It kept morale from collapsing. And it reminded the world that even in the darkest waters, brilliance could still shine through. That a mind determined to save others could bend even war to its will. It is easy to celebrate tanks and battleships, but it is far more important, more essential, to remember the battles that happened without fanfare, the victories that came in silence, the heroes whose weapons were simply ideas, courage, and the will to try it. The lesson of the Ghost Fleet endures far beyond war. It teaches us that resistance does not always mean confrontation, that victory does not always come with glory, that the most effective solutions are sometimes those that feel invisible, too quiet to notice, too clever to trace. It teaches us that ordinary people, armed only with knowledge and conviction, can change the course of history, and that innovation, especially in times of desperation, is not just a tool, it is a lifeline. As decades pass and the last veterans of the Atlantic fade into memory, the story of the invisible convoy reminds us that the sea is not the only place where battles are fought, that the greatest struggle is often within us, between doubt and action, fear and imagination, and that sometimes all it takes to turn the tide is a whisper in the dark, sent by someone the world will never know.